I want to welcome you to today's events. We have some great speakers and opportunities to network and talk about individually and collectively what we're doing in the classrooms for our students, what we're doing outside the classrooms. This is just has a special place in my heart. Our internationalizing effort is just phenomenal in what we've been able to do to bring the world to PCC. Many times our community college students can't travel, can't study abroad for various reasons, but we are certainly bringing the world to PCC. And the primary benefit to that, of course, is our students, but also our international students who step off the plane in a very strange world to further their education. And I believe that in the last few years, the welcoming environment to our international students has grown phenomenally. And I owe this to the faculty and the staff who participate in this effort. I do want to put a plug for our International Steering Committee. Brian Hull is our chair. Come on, Brian, stand up. Always looking for new energy. So if you are interested in working very, very hard in this effort and working with some phenomenal faculty who have really made this their passion the last 5 years, please see Brian and join the steering committee because we're always looking for good energy and knowledge. I'm very pleased to still be affiliated with the East-West Center. Peter and I were trying to figure out how long ago did we have our first conference with them. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago. And we have become a regional center. And we, through our affiliation with East-West, we now teach Chinese at PCC. And while that was on our academic master plan, we were able to accelerate that effort. And we believe that that is a great service to our students. So nice to see you again. I would strongly urge you to pick up the book, A Singular Woman, the story of President Barack Obama's mother. It not only tells a wonderful story of his impact of her on our president, it's a wonderful story of the East-West Center. Phenomenal story, and I was so intrigued with that. We're just having some really great things happening at PCC in an international way. Guess if I can take just a quick moment and talk to faculty here because there's something that's happening at home that is causing us to want to run out and buy hair color. PCC is as big as the state of Rhode Island. This week, we are moving over 100,000 students from the street into classrooms. It's a phenomenal event that we do with one hand tied behind our back, and we're very proud of that. Although this week we are doing it without technology, we're doing it without email, without telephones, and sometimes our distance learning is a little challenging. And I've been spending the whole week in a bunker, having discussions around this where I've become quite at home in a bunker, and that's not a good thing. I just want to thank the faculty for this week. We know how harried it is getting people into classes, getting your classes started, and we also know now how dependent we are on technology. The classes are going to go. I want to thank you for all your work you're doing for our students. We are going to not mess with deadlines. If for some reason students get dropped from a class and they don't deserve to be dropped, we'll get them back in. We'll do that manually, so we'll be working through the weekend to do that. The important thing is that next week you have your classes together, no matter how many there are, and that we move forward. We are even willing to bring the walls down of distance learning so that students do not reach a barrier in getting into class. So those are the decisions that are being made right now. I kind of pondered on this and thought, you know, there are forces out there today that can take down the internet. And think about, we're seeing this on an impact on the size of Rhode Island. Think about this on a global perspective. and what this would do with our international monetary system, the economics, the politics, and things like that. So this is an important thing, and we are reaching Friday. We are going to disperse on Sunday. We're going to disperse probably about $30 million in student financial aid. It will go. So our important thing is get the money in the hands of students, get the students in the classroom, and make sure they have all the supplies and books that they need, and support our faculty. So thank you so much. This has been trying, and there will be a message to faculty, hopefully if email's working. If not, we'll send it through smoke signals about how much we appreciate all you do, and please don't worry, we're doing the worrying on your behalf. And just send hair color. I like Clairol. So I'm not going to bother you with any more of our troubles, but the world is smaller today. We're seeing the impact of the euro and the European community economically, and we need to worry about how that's going to impact us as we possibly may be moving into a double-digit recession. These are the realities today, and I am so happy to be able to have this dialogue because I know that our faculty will take this back into the classroom and do very rich things on behalf of our students. So welcome everyone. Thank you everyone who have come to us from other states. I know your classes are starting and you need to be with your students too, but this is important to us and we appreciate so much taking the time on a Friday morning to talk about very important things. So welcome and have a great weekend. Sleep well. Everything's just fine.
Okay, I'm very pleased to welcome our first presenter this morning. We have with us Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom. He's here from UC Irvine, where he is professor of history. He's a China specialist there. Some of his books include Student Protests in 20th Century China, The View from Shanghai, Global Shanghai, and China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know. We're very pleased to have with us today Professor Jeffrey Wasserstrom.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to be talking about, this shamelessly self-promoting book here. I'm not really going to be talking about the book, but I do love the cover, so I'm delighted that in the welcome it was mentioned. The cover suggests something that's been important in my work and writing and teaching for the last 20 years, which is thinking about how China, what has changed and what hasn't changed in China. I first went to China in the mid-1980s, and so the China that I knew in the mid-1980s, the bottom part of that picture still fits in very much with what things were going on in China then. The Communist Party was in power. It's still in power. It's still voting in unison on virtually everything that comes in front of it. But the scene at the top of young people at a punk rock concert there taken around 2000. I didn't take these photos. I've taken some of the photos you'll see, but not these. That was a scene that I couldn't imagine encountering in China in the mid-1980s. And looking forward, I figured that could only happen if what you see on the bottom part of the picture had stopped happening. It'd be only if the Communist Party was not in power that there would be that kind of free expression. Well, of course, we have this strange phenomenon here where the bottom part has stayed, but the top part has come in. And the story of China now is about all sorts of changes in the economic and in the cultural sphere while there's a kind of political continuity there. In the talk today, because I'm going to focus on US-China relations and particularly American images of China, I'll be talking about change and continuity, but change in continuity in how we think about China for the most part, rather than in what's going on in China itself. But in the question and answer session, I'd be happy to take any questions about the domestic side of the story, how China has been changing, what's been staying the same, and linking up two links to the lovely welcoming remarks we had there. One is that I'd be happy to answer questions about the internet, because that's one of the things that is on people's minds when they think about China and other places. And I'd also wanted to point out, which I wasn't going to mention this except for the welcoming remarks and the references to what can turn your hair gray. The picture on this cover, when Oxford University Press presented to me as the cover they wanted to use, I said, that looks great, because it draws attention to change and continuity over time. When I started giving talks about the book, I started realizing that though it seems a study in contrast, the top and bottom pictures actually have some interesting things in common. For example, the people in both photographs are wearing Western-style clothes, which is a difference from in the Mao era, when China's leaders dressed in a way different from leaders in most of the rest of the world, and when Chinese youth dressed in ways out of step with youth in the rest of the world. So one of the things that the photograph actually shows is that over the last 30 years, both the Chinese elite and Chinese youth have gotten to look and act in some settings much more like their counterparts in other parts of the world. But then a colleague of mine at Irvine in sociology who grew up in China and goes back and forth from China, he says, well, there's something more interesting about what the seemingly very different young men in the top picture and older men in the bottom picture have in common, which is they all dye their hair. The ones on top to associate with youth culture, the ones on the bottom because the Chinese Communist Party claims to be handing power off to younger and younger people, but it's 68-year-olds handing it to 66-year-olds. So the shoe polish black hair dye fits in with that. So, without further ado, American images of China, how they've changed and stayed the same over time. And I won't be showing you a lot of words on the screen. I like using what I didn't know the word for it until recently, but apparently it's called Zen PowerPoint, where you just show some images up there that might spark enlightenment, but don't actually spell it out for you. But I do want to throw out these overarching themes I'll be returning to in different ways. One is the mutually entwined images, that China and the US have a love-hate relationship with each other. And this is long-term and enduring, and I'll talk more about the American love-hate relationship with China, but I'd be happy to take questions that talk about the Chinese love-hate relationship with the United States, which shows through in Chinese people often have high expectations for what the US can be or seems to be in the world, and then those expectations are periodically dashed in the same way that our hopes about China are periodically dashed. And these just aren't feelings that either country necessarily has about a lot of other parts of the world. There are a lot of parts of the world that we can go long stretches as Americans without thinking much about one way or another, whether pitying or feeling excitement about. China we tend to feel something about in a way that we don't necessarily have as defined feelings even about countries that I used to think is that China is closer to us just across the Pacific than, say, India is. And we tend to have stronger feelings about China for good and ill than we do about India. But proximity isn't enough. We have stronger feelings about China than we do about Brazil, a country that's increasingly becoming important. For many of the same reasons China is becoming important now, but you won't see nearly as many articles, at least yet, in a newspaper about them. There's a tendency on both sides to imagine that the other country is simpler than it actually is. And in fact, I find it hard not to fall into this pattern myself. I say things, even though I resist this, of what China thinks about the US, or people will ask me, what do the Chinese think about the United States? And I always want to begin by saying, which Chinese do you mean? China's in many ways, I start my lectures on Chinese history saying to my students, don't think of China as being like a country like France as an equivalent unit. Think of it more as a unit like Europe, with as much diversity within it as there is within Europe, as much linguistic diversity, where through much of the history, the shared written script of official Mandarin Chinese provided a glue that knit together the elite around China, but people spoke at home things that were as different from what was being spoken 100 miles away as 100 miles, 200, 300 miles, it might be as different as speaking English with a Southern accent and speaking English with a British accent might be. But you go 500 or 1,000 miles and it's as different as French is from Italian. You go a little farther, and it's as different as English is from German. And you might just recognize one or two words, but you really won't know what's going on. And the written script connecting people was sort of like the way that Latin connected the elite throughout Europe. So think of it as like a continent rather than like a country. So I will slip into times of saying the Chinese or Chinese attitudes toward X, but really we should keep that difference in mind. And it's not just regional difference, it's generational differences, it's class differences as well, and gender differences. But there's a continuing tendency of Americans to want to know what the Chinese think, and there's the same tendency of Chinese to ask me when I'm in China, so what do people in your country think about our country? And so there's a tendency on both sides to oversimplify things, and it leads to a lot of misunderstanding for different dynamics. One of the problems in Chinese perceptions of America is that Chinese newspapers have gotten more interesting than they used to be, but still tend to only have editorials that are in step with the government's line, and tend to even have opinion pieces that are at least roughly congruent with the official line. So whenever a Chinese reader of American newspapers come across an op-ed that is virulently anti-Chinese, there's a presumption that this is a prevailing attitude in the United States, even if that same newspaper would have a counter op-ed saying don't use China as a scapegoat. Or when Chinese tune into the Republican presidential debates and hear people who are running for office and allowed to speak on television, so surely must be somehow the mainstream, saying things that are very strongly against China, this will be an assumption that somehow lots of Americans or all Americans think that way. Conversely, we often blow up into a presumption about all Chinese, things that we happen to come across about China. American fantasies of China, and this is the main theme I'll be talking about, are ricochet between fantasies of imminent conversion and deeply felt worries about China somehow being implacably other or different and threatening. I'll talk about what I call the American China dream, as well as an American China nightmare. And these images up there are just meant to spark ideas, or I'll mention when they come from, but they all represent a moment of hopefulness of how China could potentially be going from being radically other, distant, and threatening to being this kind of wonderful friendship between the United States and China. The picture closest to me is of Song Mei-ling, Madam Chiang Kai-shek, who was an American born and educated. She graduated from Wellesley College. She spoke beautiful English. She was Christian, and she was married to the most powerful man in China, Chiang Kai-shek, in the 1930s and 40s. They were celebrated as finally China was in the hands of people we could do business with and would be converting their country. We were allies during World War II. Madam Chiang Kai-shek had converted her husband to Christianity. So here was this person who was allied with us, was the opponent of communists at that point, that we went back and forth in alliances with them for various reasons. So there was this dream of possible friendship. And this is Song Mei-ling with Eleanor Roosevelt. And so this is this idea of a meeting of the minds, Chinese and Western, a possible conversion, which in an earlier phase was, and still then, conversion to Christianity, but at later points would be converting to democracy, at a later point just converting to consumers who wanted to buy our goods. So we have the steps there. This is the kind of moment of closeness, and Song Mei-ling came to the United States, spoke before Congress, and had this very eloquent plea for why the United States should support China. She charmed Congress. There was talk that she did more than simply that she charmed quite intimately one powerful American leader, but I won't be talking about that. There will be nothing salacious gossip here. The most salacious thing will be the second slide, which is the site of Mao and Nixon dancing, which is taken from the New Yorker, had that. And this was about after a period of estrangement, this sort of idea of this wonderful emerging partnership between China and the United States being sundered by China falling to communism and the Korean War pitting us against one another. And Mao was seen as the implacable other. He was demonized in many ways. There was a book that came out, Mao Zedong, Emperor of the Blue Ants, or the Empire of the Blue Ants. The idea was that all Chinese were alike and were out to be opposed to whatever we were for. Then when Mao and Nixon met, there was the idea of, the possibility of a new rapprochement, which then picked up speed when Deng Xiaoping followed Mao and came to the United States, put on a cowboy hat. The idea that all the things that had been said about Chiang Kai-shek, finally China is in the hands of a leader who sort of we can deal with, who sees things our way. There was a new dream then of possible conversion. And the great symbol of the American China dream, this dream of conversion, if Madame Chiang Kai-shek was the great symbol in the 1930s and 40s, Yao Ming at the far end over there was the symbol of it around the turn of the millennium. Yao Ming, what could be more American or more in step with American values than playing for the NBA and helping to popularize the NBA in China? Well, one thing could be more American than that, helping to sell Big Macs. So you see Yao Ming, the story of this bicultural person who's moving between China and America and is beloved in both places. This would be the dream of this kind of conversion to a China that was in step with American ways. But there's always periodically been countering with that and sometimes coexisting the American-China nightmare of China as I said, implacably other or threatening. And often then it's about dreams of, very bizarrely, dreams of even a China that has no possibility of directly coming to our shores. The fear is that that will happen. And here I'll be talking about the Boxer Rising, which this political cartoon on this side is about. The Boxer Rising in 1900 involved an uprising by North Chinese peasants who felt that the country had gone wrong because a foreign religion had made it onto its shores and foreigners had been pushing China around. There was a terrible drought, and people began to believe that this must be that the gods were angry at this coming of the foreign religion. So the Boxer insurgents rose up and killed Christians in China, but especially, mostly Chinese Christians, either long-term Christian families or ones who'd recently converted, also attacked some foreign missionaries. And then at the height of the movement, they surrounded the foreign legation quarter in Beijing, and so foreigners were besieged there. And then eventually, a consortium of foreign troops marched in and lifted the siege, crushed the insurrection, and then went on a killing rampage of their own, killing a lot of Chinese who had never been Boxers as signs of retribution. So the events are remembered very differently in the two parts of the world, which I'll get to in a bit. But what strikes me as most interesting about the political cartoon there is that it shows the Boxer of the image as a dehumanized figure with claws more than hands. So it's a very nightmarish image. And the Boxers were very violent. But what was clear was the Boxers had no interest in going outside of China. All their concern was about what was going on with China. And yet this shows the Boxer circling the globe. And there were American newspapers at the time, at least a magazine that said this was the biggest threat to Christendom since Genghis Khan, that this was something that would start in China and would come to our shores. The idea of the yellow peril that was also very, very alive in Europe was based on this idea of what was happening there would affect us. So this notion of a China threat, which I would say now in a similar way, the People's Liberation Army is building up militarily. It's not building up to project force at us. It's building up. I would be nervous if I were one of China's neighbors if that's going on. So I think the fact that when there is this nightmare, it's not just about what's going on in China or near China, but it's something that we feel directly threatened by, gives a special power to the nightmare visions as well. So I'll be toggling between, as images of China have toggled between this dream and the nightmare, and they often do coexist. One moment that they coexisted or that they moved in rapid transition was 1989 with the Tiananmen uprising. And this image was one of the last times, I think, that the dream was most powerful and most ascendant, and also gives a perfect example of what I mean by both the dream and the nightmare oversimplifying Chinese realities in many ways and missing the complexity of what's going on in China. This was the most photogenic in America image of the movement until the massacre put an end to the movement and the vision of the man standing in front of the tank became the iconic figure of the movement. This was the iconic shot of what was known as the goddess of democracy. And in the American press, much was made of the fact that it was modeled on the Statue of Liberty. And there actually were some students in the 1980s who carried replicas of the Statue of Liberty. This is not the Statue of Liberty. It's definitely influenced by the Statue of Liberty, but there's a term for liberty and there's a term for democracy in China. They're different terms, and the students chose Goddess of Democracy for this one. It also is holding up the torch with two hands rather than one, and it resonates in Chinese imaginations both with a foreign symbol and with a domestic one. It looks a good deal like the goddess Guanyin, who's the goddess of mercy in Chinese folk culture. But beyond that, the notion that the movement in Tiananmen Square was about trying to transform China to become a country like ours, or to Americanize China, is a very powerful part of the story of the Tiananmen protests in the American media, which played into these long-term dreams of conversion and imminent conversion. There were some students who wore things that reinforced that. There were students who had the banners that said, give me liberty or give me death, or we shall overcome. So clearly American ideals and historical events were an influence. But that's not what all the banners said, and it's certainly not what necessarily inspired hundreds of thousands of workers to join tens of thousands of students on the streets and on the squares. The students, in appealing to workers in particular and to each other, because of their concern at that moment was not about free elections. Their concern at that point was about government corruption, which is still the biggest source of discontent in China. This feeling that as the economic reforms were going forward, the only people clearly benefiting, or the people benefiting unfairly, were those with close ties to officials or officials themselves, the children of high officials. The first posters of the Tiananmen protests were criticizing nepotism in the government. And a lot of the posters that were put up in Chinese referred to immoral current officials and called for an end to corruption. And they were a call, in a sense, for the Chinese Communist Party not to be overthrown, but to start living up to its own rhetoric and its own, the best part of its own tradition. Students also presented themselves on the square as carrying on in the tradition of the May 4th movement of 1919, the most important patriotic movement in Chinese history to that point that had been student-led, an event that was celebrated by the Communist Party, but the students were saying, you don't live up to those ideals anymore, you should. So it was a movement driven by domestic concerns as well as by admiration of any foreign place. And in admiration of foreign places, there was also admiration for people power in the Philippines that had been a bit before. There were admiration for actually Gorbachev at that point as a reformer. One banner said, heaven was unfair to China. They gave Russia Gorbachev, and all we got was a Deng Xiaoping, because Gorbachev at that point was pushing for political reform as well. The banners on the flags waving don't say anything about corruption, and they don't say anything about American or Soviet or any ideals. They're simply the names of units that are saying, we are here supporting this movement. They're names of universities and departments within universities following on in a tradition of Chinese protest and participation in rituals. There were also a lot of students who had headbands emblazoned with slogans that they'd borrowed from South Korean protests against American-backed authoritarian regimes. And there were other things that were done that the students associated with other things. They went on a hunger strike, one of their great events, and they said they borrowed that in part from the protests against apartheid. So it was a much more complicated thing, and this is another thing that Chinese and Americans often get wrong. We often think of ourselves as the only countries that matter when we're thinking of either place's behavior. Chinese responses to American behavior often overestimate the degree to which it's about China, and Americans often overestimate how much something is about us. When this image replaced the image of the goddess of democracy as the most remembered American image of 1989, it summed up what I think of as big bad China and the good Chinese syndrome, which is a tendency for the dream to be associated with individual Chinese, that if only we could connect with the ordinary Chinese people, they would want what we want. But the state gets in the way. And this idea of a state that blocks these things was perfectly summed up by the tank standing up, confronting the lone individual. By the way, the lone individual is often described in the American press on anniversary things as the student who stopped the tank near Tiananmen Square. He probably wasn't a student. He was probably a printer, another kind of worker. But we overstated the importance of the students because the students were the ones who fit most easily into our dream of conversion. We also hear every year, well, the Chinese government denies there was a massacre, which is a big lie, which is a terrible lie. The American version of the event is often just a misremembering that is true because there was a massacre by state forces of protesters, but we get a few key things wrong. One common shorthand for saying what happened in 1989 in the massacre is to say it was a massacre, it was the time when students were mowed down by tanks in Tiananmen Square. Now that's better than the big lie, but it gets several things wrong. Most people, and perhaps most people were killed outside of Tiananmen Square. It's not clear that anybody was killed literally in the square. The killing fields were near, but not in. Most of the people killed were not students, but workers. And most of them were killed by automatic weapon fire rather than tanks rolling over them. So aside from that, everything about tanks rolling over students in Tiananmen Square is correct. It's hard to get a laugh out of Tiananmen, sorry. This is the two faces of Yao Ming, which I like to show this slide to illustrate the way in which almost any story can be spun with a dream or nightmare. The Tiananmen story went quickly from the dream to the nightmare with the massacre. That was something that actually happened. But even the same change of our feelings or insecurities can change things. Yao Ming's story as a cultural go-between, a man who was between worlds, is one way the story is told. Another way the Yao Ming story is told, which is highlighted in a book called Operation Yao Ming, or really highlighted in the distillation, the oversimplification of the argument of that book, but still, it was in the book, which goes something like this. Yao Ming's parents were both superstars at a lower level in basketball. The Chinese state arranged for them to marry and produce a Frankenstein-like super basketball player who would win glory for China. Now, there is a basis to this. Yao Ming's parents were very, very talented basketball players. Their work units did encourage them to get together, and they did produce a wonderful basketball player who has won glory for China playing on national teams. I mean, where it skews it is, you know, a lot of celebrities end up marrying other celebrities. China work units often stepped in, were sort of like the family writ large, and they did try to broker marriages in the most controlled periods of the Mao period. But the fact that two very strong basketball players would end up marrying is not that strange if we think about celebrities often marry other celebrities. And we don't see anything nefarious about Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie getting together to produce the ultimate Academy Award winner. So there's a basis to this story and a basis to the other story of Yao Ming, but I mean, the truth is somewhere in between. Yao Ming has not shed his attachment to China and the attachment to patriotic goals, and I'm saying patriotic because nationalistic tends to be when we don't like something and patriotic when we do, so I'll try to move between them. But anyway, so both of these stories are there, but there's a desire to tell it as one or the other story rather than say it's something more complicated, and that's, I think, the root of the problem here. Chinese misunderstandings of the US, which I'm not going to dwell on, but there's generally been the hope that the US will be a different kind of imperialist power. It's not just in China that this view is held. There's a strong tradition in America of rhetoric that talks about our being founded through a revolution that was about overthrowing colonialism, and that we have a special sympathy for colonized peoples, and that we will not have a former empire ourselves. And there's a long tradition of people viewing our behavior as not matching that ideology, or that when push comes to shove, either we don't really stand up to the imperialist powers of the West, or Japan, or that we do things like annexing Hawaii would be perhaps relevant with the East-West Center's participation here, that look an awful lot like what imperialist powers do. I mean, so, or what we did in the Philippines earlier than that. So in China, there's been a back and forth, an excitement about the idea that America stands for something very different, and then periodic disappointment in either our behavior or how our behavior is read, and as failing to live up to that. So there was excitement America didn't take formal pieces of China under its control, the way Britain, France, Germany, and eventually Japan all did. We eschewed having this kind of formal colonial presence in China. We were willing to take advantage of terms of extraterritoriality and some things that advantaged foreigners, including us, but we still seemed to be doing things differently. But then we had the immigration policies that discriminated against Chinese. So then there was this kind of regret or disappointment in what we did. There was our fighting with China against Japan during World War II, but then there was the Korean War, which was seen in China as us trying to create a client state in South Korea that we would have as a bulwark against China. So there's this is part of the problem. And the other problem, which I mentioned, is that a misunderstanding of the American media system means you can find enough evidence to support a view of Americans actually, say, liking empire and wanting to keep China down to reinforce that disappointment. The other big concept I want to throw out, which I'm adapting from Sheila K. Johnson's work, she has a book called The Japanese in American Eyes, where she talks about the shifting images of Japan in American eyes. And it's called the China-Japan seesaw effect, is what I call it, which is basically that when Japan is in favor in the American imagination, China tends to be out of favor and vice versa, as though we only have time to be scared of one Asian country, and we only have time or space in our mind to admire and have great hopes for the other. So just rapidly, in 1900, the year of the Boxers, China was down for good reasons. Japan was up. Japanese troops marched in with this coalition of eight armies that lifted the siege and did away with this threat to civilization. And writings on Japan at that time were saying, the Japanese culture is very different from the Chinese culture. The Chinese culture is much more warlike and violent. The Japanese culture is more peaceable, and Japan is the country that really wants to learn from us and become modern and become a good citizen of the world. Flash forward to 1937, or 1941 in particular at the end of it, and you have the exact opposite things being said about the two cultures. America is saying that China is the country that has never fought an aggressive war in the 4,000 years of its history, whereas Japan is trying to take over the world. Chinese are clearly trying to learn from us and become good citizens of the world. Japan is not. Fine, so which is it, China or Japan? Well, 1950s, the opposite is once again true. Japan is our ally. They've learned their lesson, and the basic part of the root part of their culture has come to the fore again, and they're peaceable and trying to learn from us. China, we were fooled. Too bad. We didn't understand that at heart they were warlike. Back and forth. In the 1980s, Japan was down and China was up quite clearly. And if you had a conference and you had a speaker talking about American fears about a part of Asia, it would be fears about Japan. This was when there were fears about Japan. Japanese were threatening our jobs, supposedly. They were buying up high-profile buildings, and there was a lot of anxiety in America about that. Many of the same things now being said about China, or fears. When I was going to graduate school to study Chinese in the 1980s, sure that I would not be able to get an academic job, I was studying Chinese in part because I wanted to be a historian. I wanted to do graduate work in history, and I didn't think I could get a job teaching history. So at least if I learned Chinese and had some knowledge of China, I figured I could get a job doing something. Journalism, government, China was going to be important. A lot of people said, well, yeah, I kind of get that, because my first love was British or French history, and of course I'd be unemployed if I did that. But they said, if you were really being pragmatic, shouldn't you be learning Japanese? They're the country that really matters and really challenging. They're the main competitor economically, Or why aren't you learning Russian? You know, because the Soviet Union, that's the big Communist Party-led country that's, you know, the dominant threat to us militarily. And so I stuck with Chinese. I liked Chinese food. I liked going to China. And I wanted to go to China more than I wanted to go to Japan or Russia for whatever reason. And I liked studying revolutions, and China had a good number of those, though that would have been a reason to do Russian. But anyway, I stuck with China. And as my wife, who's not a China specialist, but has had to live with China for a lot of the last few decades, lived there teaching English for a year. She said in the end, she tells me I got the last laugh because now China is Japan plus Russia. So we've got these back and forth of up and down with China and Japan, and now it's harder to know what's going on, but certainly the fears about Japan are now on China. Maybe China also has colonized both the dream and the nightmare for the moment, which occasionally happens. All right, the long legacy of the Boxers. I've mentioned this already, so I won't dwell on it much, except that it's probably the event that has had the clearest enduring legacy on both American ideas about China and about Chinese ideas about the West in particular. And it was an important event at the time. I have an image over there. It was one of the first events. There was this new media. You've been hearing about new media, right? New media that annihilates all sense of time and space. New media that allows you to feel like you are on the other side of the world as something's unfolding. Well, the Boxers took place at a time of new media. It was called the telegraph. People were amazed that they could follow events on the other side of the world in something like real time. It was also a media event in other ways. It was something that was on the newspapers. I mean, if you want to look at a time in the past, there have been a few moments, like the present, when the newspaper will always have a China story every week. The Boxers was one of those times. And the picture on the far side shows a reenactment of the Boxer crisis that was done in Earl's Court within a few months of the lifting of the siege. The Boxers were also the subject of some of the first silent movies, were reenactments of the Boxer uprising. So it was this kind of moment when China was very much in front of our eyes in many ways, even though it was far away. So that, I think, resonates with the present. My next book's going to be on the Boxers, so I'm obsessed with it. But it's also something that's understood totally differently in China and in the West. In the West, the story is about a threat to civilization coming from a distant part of the world that is put down in the nick of time with an order restored. That's how the story's told in the conventional telling in the West. The conventional telling in China is very different. It's varied over time, but it goes something now like this. The Boxers, they had reasons to be angry. Whether or not we agree with everything they did, you've got to understand why they were rising up. But the reaction to them was completely out of proportion. The Westerners and Japan marched in and went about acting in these savage ways, even though they had just been accusing the Boxers of being savages. Now, some of this view of the event was true at the time. A few Westerners did think in these ways. And this is a powerful political cartoon from the time that shows the image of, first it was the attack of barbarity against civilization, and then later everything was different. It was civilization putting down barbarism but behaving exactly the same way. Mark Twain was probably the most famous Westerner to have this view of, or actually he went further. He said, if I was Chinese, I'd be a Boxer. They hated missionaries. That was fine by him. And he said, what do the Chinese want in the Boxer Rising? They want to kick out foreign powers. What was our revolution about? Kicking out foreign powers. So he was a real radical critic of American imperialism, and he has been beloved in China for a good reason, in part because of that. So these two versions of the story. And this is the, Charlton Heston means something special to those of us in Orange County, has strong ties there. He's not quite as important as John Wayne, who we named our airport after, and we put up a giant statue of. But 55 Days at Peking, and it's not in French, I just could only find a French poster on the web. It literally shows the Boxer Rising being put down by the American cavalry marching in, with some help from the other foreign powers. And the Boxers are portrayed in that. It becomes very much like a Western transposed to the East. The Boxers are even shown throwing things that look a lot like tomahawks. So it's very much like the whole rhetoric of the old-fashioned Western with no moral ambiguity. And as the credits roll, the story's over. And you don't hear anything about the killing that's done of innocent Chinese or the looting of Chinese treasures that went on. Things that you hear a lot about in the Chinese version of the story. And the reason why the Boxers matter and that they're in the popular imagination, East and West, is that whenever there's a clash between China and the West, the Boxers will come up, often on both sides. And I'll give you a specific example of that in a minute. But first, a cheap shot, because particularly this is important. Whoops. Okay. Charlton Heston doesn't mean anything to my students, so I don't get much mileage out of 55 Days of Peking. But I get more mileage out of this, though I need to update it a little further. This is Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which has an episode that includes time traveling or memory back to Peking in 1900, Beijing, the time of the Boxers. And what I love about this, I show sometimes a clip from it, but this is the comic book version of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And what's great, and I won't go into the whole mythology of vampires and vampire slayers for the uninitiated, I'm still trying to sort it out myself, but in essence, there's a Westerner who's a vampire who's remembering earlier incarnations of his vampireness, and this is him in China trying to kill a vampire slayer. Those are the good people, who was actually a Chinese woman in the mythology here. So he's just killed the Chinese vampire slayer, and this is the middle of the Boxer crisis. And the vampire slayer's grandfather comes running after him, and this is the even cheaper thing I like. I like the line. The Chinese person is saying foreigners, demons, because one of the terms for foreigners then was foreign devils, so it fits well, demons. And then, you killed my granddaughter. And then the vampire says, bugger off, old man, and keep it down, right? We're British and we're vampires. That's 2 strikes against us if we're discovered. Okay, the Boxers as legacy, or how the Boxers come up. This is a photograph I took during my most exciting trip to China, which was in 1999. In May of 1999, I was in China right when NATO was carrying out a campaign against Serbia to put an end to ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, which is how we described NATO's activities. In China, in the Chinese press, it was seen as NATO doing an end run around the UN Security Council to carry out a peacekeeping mission, so-called, but really to kind of make sure that it kind of controlled Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia. Serbia was an ally of China, so this was seen as foreign interventionism that was unjustified. Then a bomb or missiles hit the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, killing 3 Chinese. And China erupted in patriotic protests. The government liked these particular protests because they had been criticizing NATO's actions in Serbia. Nobody likes likes people in their embassy being killed. Embassies are supposed to be neutral ground. They're actually supposed to be a part of your country that happens to be surrounded by another country. So this was seen as NATO bombs hitting China. So there were these protests that I got to see, anti-American, anti-NATO hegemonism protests. And they focused largely on America because America looms so large and really was seen as dominating NATO. There was a call for boycotting British and American goods because Britain and America were the leading powers in NATO at the time. But nobody could figure out in China what a British good was to boycott. Americans, it was very easy. Stop eating McDonald's, stop drinking Coke, don't take the GRE. So you could do that. Not this week, take it next week. This was, my friend Prasenjit Dwara, a China historian, said he had come up with the adage for a certain way of thinking of certain kinds of popular nationalism in China now is day 1, eat at McDonald's, day 2, boycott McDonald's, day 3, eat at McDonald's. So there was something of that element to it. But there was this anti-American protest, and I love the creativity, actually. In the American press, it was portrayed largely as state-run protests. It was something more complicated, I think. It was genuine outrage that then the government tried to steer and control. Because once people are on the streets in China complaining about a foreign power, they'll say China's a great country, it shouldn't be mistreated this way by a foreign power. Pretty soon, actually, it can become day one, don't complain about anything. Day two, complain about foreign powers. Day three, complain about your own officials. So there was a worry about the protests. China's a great country, we shouldn't be let it pushed around. China's a great country, maybe we should be run by better people. So the government was trying to steer it. And I think there was a lot of creativity. The students hadn't been allowed to protest anything since 1989, and they loved being on the streets again. I like that American eagle that's painted with each of the feathers as a missile, like the missiles that hit the embassy. And there were other kinds of creativity. The American military, NATO, all said this was a complete mistake to have hit it. It was an accident. They were sorry. The Chinese, no Chinese I met believed that was possible. They thought our technology was much too good. We didn't make mistakes like that. I tried to say, well, a few days before we had hit an Italian ski lift, and Italy was our ally, but still there was this belief that this was an effort to keep China down and to teach China a lesson. And what came up in some writings about it at the time was, it's just like the Boxers all over again. And the term for NATO, this allied army, is the same, has some of the same characters as the 8 allied armies that came in to suppress the Boxers in 1900. And what's said is, hasn't the world changed at all since 1900? There's still consortiums of the Western powers that are pushing around any weak country or any country they disagree with. So it was seen as what NATO was doing in Serbia was like what the invasion of China had been like, and the killing of the Chinese in the embassy had been seen as reminding them of the horrors of 1900. In USA Today, when these protests of this sort went outside of the American embassy and people threw paintballs and paving stones at the American embassy, and the American ambassador was pinned inside his place in Beijing, and the Boxers, remember, had held people besieged in the foreign diplomatic quarter of Beijing, USA Today said, hasn't China learned anything since the Boxer Rising? They're doing the same kinds of things again. So both of this is a misunderstanding. Speaking of misunderstandings, though I like to think of myself as a skilled analyst of cultural symbols, I like to show this image periodically to remind me of how wrong I can be at sometimes, or how complicated understanding symbols is. So does everybody know who that is? Che, good. I knew it was Che. I brought this picture back. Sorry, the picture's not very good. I took it, on the fly. Anyway, it was a challenging moment to take pictures. At one point, somebody from across the street yelled in Chinese, are you an American? If you're an American, I want to kill you. A BBC correspondent had very helpfully taught me how to say, I'm Australian. So I had an answer there. I wanted to say I was Canadian, but apparently that wouldn't work because Canada's in NATO. So anyway, I wasn't really that scared. The guy stayed on the other side of the street after all. And there were police present to try to keep the protests from getting out of hand, and also probably to keep there from being an incident involving me. But anyway, I was taking the pictures quickly, let's just say. And I brought this picture home, and I showed it to one of my students at Indiana University, and I was so proud of myself. I said, wasn't this the perfect shirt to wear to an anti-American protest? Che, along with everything else he did, was anti-American imperialism. He was a Yankee. This was a Yankee go home rally, Yankees go home, and here he was wearing a Che t-shirt. And my student said, you don't get it. I said, isn't that Che? He said, yeah, it's Che, but you don't get it. This is only part of the photo, and I'll show you the other part of the photo, the larger one, which is very, very hard to see. But at the far corner on the other hand, there's another t-shirt, and you'll just have to take my word for it. It has a face on it as well. And my student recognized that I didn't, and this has a Northwest tie to it. It's Kurt Cobain. And the Che t-shirt that the guy is wearing, and the two are clearly friends who are standing together, buddies who wore kind of parallel shirts. The Che t-shirt is the album cover of Rage Against the Machine's last album, or at that time, or the previous album. And so what they were doing was going to the anti-American rally wearing their t-shirts of their favorite American bands. which suggests a more complicated set of emotions about China, about America, an ability to resent the American government and be attracted to American popular culture at the same time. Now, it's even more complicated than that because these are critical bands. These are individuals who are both seen as young martyrs. These are also anti-establishment bands. So you could say that's the right thing to wear to a protest of various sorts. All that fits. The protesters were both trying to be part of kind of global youthful rebelliousness and criticizing a form of imperialism, fitting in with what their government wanted them to do, but also doing things that spoke to a whole nother cultural or generational agenda. So I like to show that also just to show the complexities of this. So where are we now? We're in old patterns in a changed world where it's challenging to move forward. A lot of this ricocheting back between love and hate on both sides of the Pacific is still there. One thing that's really changed that I think is just radically different that I'll dwell on a little bit is that we're dealing with a different kind of China. Actually, I got an email this morning from an American historian I've been communicating with about writing something for his magazine about China. And he just said one thing about how things have really changed from a historian's point of view, who just pays peripheral interest in China. They're talking about whether China will help bail Europe out of its financial crisis. And you've just got to think about how unimaginable it was that China, which we always thought of as a poor country, and we worried about whether it would be able to feed its population, is now talking about bailing out possibly even Europe. They're also planning a space station, and there was just a big space shot yesterday. So we're in a new phase where the worries we have about China are in many ways about it being hyper-modern rather than it being backward. So something's different there. We're also in an era of very quick swings back and forth between the love and hate. It used to sometimes take decades. You could say 1937 to 45, the dream was in play. 1950 through 1960, it was all nightmare, about mainland China at least. Now we can go from year to year or month to month with fear or collaboration. And the final thing is that the rest of the world matters, which I've brought in different ways, but we often tend to think Beijing and Washington act as though, and popular visions too, that we're sort of the only games in town. We're two really big, really powerful countries, and what we do matters a lot, but we're not always sometimes what happens in neither country changes the way things happen in our relationship. So to illustrate that, the point about modernization, if you just go back to the late 1970s, you don't have to go back to the 20s and 30s when the worry was would China be able to feed itself, but as recently as the 1970s, Deng Xiaoping made his watchword the four modernizations. He said that under Mao, China had been too dominated by ideology. China needed to focus on development and modernization. So he called for these four modernizations, and he was Times Man of the Year twice, celebrated. That hadn't happened to a Chinese leader since Chiang Kai-shek, who had also talked about China just needed to modernize. And he had also been Times Man of the Year twice, or once he was part of the Couple of the Year with his wife. So Deng Xiaoping was calling for modernizations, and a lot of supporters of him in China were saying, this is what we need. This is what China needs to make itself strong and develop. Americans often were rooting for China to do that because our still tendency was to think that what we have to worry about with China is it being unable to feed its population or it being not developed enough. So a famous American in 1979, who when Deng Xiaoping came to America, he got to address Deng Xiaoping directly and said, Mr. Vice Premier, it's with great joy that we welcome you to our country, and it's with true love that we extend our very best wishes to you and your people on your new long march toward modernization in this century. Does anybody know what famous American might have said that? Any guesses? Okay, shout up. All right, Nixon, good answer, it's wrong. Anyone else? Kissinger, another good answer, also wrong. Carter, the third good answer that's wrong. The right answer, well, let me just say, this part of the talk means something special if I give it in Colorado. Got it. John Denver, who got to perform Rocky Mountain High to Deng Xiaoping and his wife. Deng's wife is shown on a video clip of this looking utterly baffled by this song and the performance. And you could see that performance in The Gate of Heavenly Peace, a wonderful film about the Tiananmen protests that was shown on Frontline. And I had to, the fact that John Denver, he then became the only one of two pop groups that from the West that was played regularly in China when I was there in the mid-'80s. Are you American? Oh, do you know how to sing Country Roads? The other group was the Carpenters. I guess those two were seen as insufficiently threatening to the moral order. So everyone from supporters of Deng Xiaoping to John Denver to Carter and the rest were all rooting for China to modernize. And the American dream at that point was, look, if China modernizes, it will democratize. Because once you start getting the trappings of middle-class life, then you want more control over how politics are run. Once free trade comes in, it lubricates the move to liberalization, to democracy. And we've seen that in some parts of the world. As they developed, they got democratic. But another thing that's interesting to me is that within China, critics of Deng Xiaoping were also rooting for China to modernize. They just thought he needed to do something differently in order to modernize. So during the protest, the Democracy Wall protests, Wei Jingsheng, the most famous dissident in exile, or one of them now, put up a poster calling for a fifth modernization, democracy and human rights. And he thought those were good things, but his argument was that for the four modernizations to succeed, there had to be a fifth modernization, because he said without democratization, the modernization drive and economic growth will confront insurmountable obstacles. So here we have late 70s, you have Deng Xiaoping saying, we just need to modernize. Critics of Deng Xiaoping saying, if you want to modernize, first you have to democratize. You have people in the US saying, go ahead and modernize because then you will certainly democratize. Flash forward 30 years or so, and what do we have? We have a China that didn't need to democratize in order to modernize, and hasn't democratized because it's modernized. Now, parts of China are still far from having modernized. There's still poverty. There are plenty of parts of the country that don't have the fast trains and the highways and things like that capture our imagination. But the Chinese government has clearly shown that in selected places, it can definitely modernize without democratizing and keep from democratizing even after it has modernized, at least so far. So this is where we're in a changed place. In the 21st century, Shanghai has many more skyscrapers than New York, more than the entire west coast of the United States, has this futuristic freeway system, all kinds of things like that. China has technological marvels, the high-altitude train to Tibet, the fastest trains on Earth, though these have now become become more controversial because they've begun to periodically crash. There's a high-speed train crash over the summer. There was then a subway crash a few days ago in Shanghai that's leading to, and this I think is the part at the bottom, protests are as often now about the costs of modernization than what needs to be done for China to be able to modernize. Remember, the Democracy Wall poster said, without democratization, economic development won't happen. Even at Tiananmen, there was a way in which the students were saying, we need a better government because without it, China can't be strong. China won't be able to become the kind of modern country we want to live in. Now people are saying China's cities, at least, have become these modern cities, but there are problems with living in them, that the government seems to only care about splashy modernization things they can brag about, and some of the quality of life is getting so bad that even if you have fast trains, if you have all this pollution, even if you have fast trains, but the government doesn't seem to care whether they crash. This is then, so the protests that have started to take place increasingly in China, whereas for a while, and there have been tons of protests for years and years, for a while the protests tended to be focused around groups that were being left behind by the modernization drive and development drive, or in parts of the country that were far from the centers of this kind of high points of the modernization drive. Now you're starting to see those continue, but also protests by people who've been benefiting generally from, middle-class people who've been generally benefiting from economic development, but worry about the quality of life due to pollution. There were big protests about a chemical plant, toxic chemical plant in Dalian over the summer. Before that, in Shanghai, there were protests about extension of the magnetic levitation, fastest train in the world, through the center of Shanghai by people who wanted to protect their housing values and the health and safety of themselves and their children. And now I think this notion of even symbols of modernization, rather being things that all the people that got a lot of cheering from the country, there's a split. People are still cheering it. They like the idea of China being the kind of country that can compete with other countries. The fast trains can compete with Japan's was very important, long-standing rivalry of China and Japan. But now, even with this space shot, that there was just one of the most impressive space shots, while there was a lot of cheering of it in the official media and even some ordinary people, there were also people who were writing, isn't there something wrong with a government that keeps focusing on these high-profile, braggable projects when there are problems with the air quality in the cities, when there are problems like the fast trains colliding? We're moving to a period where anxiety about China's modernization is fueling protests in China and anxieties in the West, and that we've gone a long phase from earlier. The Olympics were, I think, the high point of the moment of attention shifting, a sort of seismic shift in the American image of China from when will they be able to do things on the scale or in step with the most modern countries of the world, to this anxiety of have they surpassed us or will they surpass us in some of these conventional markers of modernity. And it also led to these kinds of new version of the Chinese nightmare coming out of the Olympics. This is an episode of South Park, which the main character is having a nightmare, literally a nightmare, in which the drummers from the opening ceremonies, that we found very impressive, but many of us also found a little creepy, he sees them coming to life and coming to take over America. And what I love is the opening of it where his mother knocks on the door and says, "Eric, sweetie, are you having nightmares about the Chinese again?" And it's that again, I think, is very telling. How quickly things change. In 2001, there was a spy plane. There was a crash between an American surveillance plane and a Chinese jet that was trying to get it out of Chinese airspace, was what it said. The American story was that it was dangerously flying close to our plane that was gathering information. They crashed. The Chinese pilot died. The American plane emergency landed on Hainan Island, and the crew and pilot were held there. This, yet again, conjured up memories of the Boxers. Americans being held on Chinese soil, a Chinese death based on what was seen as an imperialist action. Chinese and American relations soured in April of 2001. There was a lot of worry about the Chinese-American tensions being the defining tension of the coming years. Now, of course, and there was an APEC summit coming up, and people were wondering, you knew I'd get APEC in somewhere. We're wondering, what would they be talking about at APEC? How would Sino-American tensions dominate APEC? They didn't dominate APEC because 9/11 happened between the spy plane incident and the APEC meeting. And so APEC was all about America trying to get China to come on board with the war on terror, or sort of at least not obstruct it. And China was trying to figure out how to get American, their bargaining goal in this was to get some groups associated with Xinjiang and the Uyghurs reclassified as terrorist groups rather than freedom fighters, and they got that in exchange for some of this. So by the time APEC came around, the U.S.-China tensions, not because of anything China and the U.S. had happened, but what had happened in the wider world, had disappeared, and we had this shot, which is not very, anyway. And it's a cheap laugh, especially for early morning talks, any cheap laugh you can get is worth it. So going forward, I think we need to pay more attention to how much the two countries have in common, to break out of the sort of ratcheting back and forth of will they convert to our ways or vice versa, but to think about the fact that for a lot of the rest of the world, we're seeing both as countries that have a fair amount in common, that talk about being anti-imperialist but seem to be not above asserting authority over other parts of the world when it suits us. We're seen as countries that are particularly prone to go our own way in international arenas, that buck trends that are global because we can. We're two of the only countries that have the death penalty, which was brought up to me in Sweden when I gave a talk saying I was going to focus on China and US talking past each other in human rights. And I was interviewed on the radio, and the Swedish interviewer said, "But we put you in the same category on a human right that's very important to us." And I would say, well, China executes a lot more people. I mean, I'm a critic of the death penalty, but there are differences in scale. They said, well, but we see this as such a fundamental thing that differences in scale aren't what we should argue about. And I've thought about that a lot lately because there's a US-China back and forth on greenhouse gases where the US says, China, this pollution stuff is so bad. You're now the biggest polluter in the world. China's response is, well, wait a minute. Per capita, we're a much smaller producer of greenhouse gases than you are. You're the biggest polluter. But for the rest of the world, really largely, the point is that China and the US are such big contributors to greenhouse gases that if we don't get our act together, the world's sunk. So this idea of arguing over who's the bigger polluter is beside the point to some extent. But also I think China and the US have important things in common that both could learn from. Not that it will lead to stop criticizing each other for things that we think the other does wrong, and I've got plenty of things I would criticize the Chinese government about, but from a position in part of understanding that the US has in the past done very similar things. And this is to think about how China now is very much in a position resembling that of the US from between the 1890s and the 1910s or so, when we were the fastest growing economy in the world, rising quickly, making the top economies, at that point places like Britain, very nervous. We were being criticized as a place that made shoddy goods and didn't respect labor. Workers couldn't unionize. We didn't respect international property, intellectual property. Dickens came on a tour of America and complained about all the black market editions of his books that were being sold here that he wasn't seeing a penny from, not unlike how J.K. Rowling's publisher views the pirating of Harry Potter in China. Many of the things, when we got to host our first World's Fair after World's Fairs had only been hosted in Europe, we were very proud of this, like China was proud of the Olympics. And we hosted not just another World's Fair, but the biggest World's Fair the world had ever seen. China just finally got to host its World's Fair, 2010, biggest World's Fair the world had ever seen. So there's a kind of brashness, the anxieties we create, the speed. People marveled at the speed with which buildings would shoot up in America. This notion of becoming an economic power, but the powers that be wondering if we're ready for prime time. Lots of these parallels are there, and they're important. And again, they shouldn't prevent criticism. But knowledge of them, I think, should inform the way we talk about criticism. And there are many other examples we could give, even examples about annexation. I mean, I brought up Hawaii. American attitudes about Hawaii have some interesting parallels to some Han Chinese views of Tibet. And a lot of Americans, I think, have sort of forgotten that the question of whether Hawaii was part of America was an open question for a long time. The stakes have never been higher, nor the situation trickier. China and the US, our relationship really is one of the things that from the world's point of view is too big to fail. We're both intertwined, our economies are codependent. We've got to figure out a way to move forward. So the challenges are, how do we move forward when we've got these long histories of misunderstanding each other? So empathy is one way, just more knowledge is another. More people in each country knowing more about the other country that gets beyond the kind of sound bites and stereotypes. And I think this is the best of times and the worst of times for making sense of China. The best of times is that if you want to read about China and you have a limited amount of time and energy to read about China and you want to read things that are incredibly well written, there are better options than there have been ever. I think this is the second golden age. I'm not the only one who's been saying this, the second golden age of freelance and journalistic writing on China by journalists who don't just cycle through China as one beat on sort of going around the globe reporting from different places, but who learn the language and enmesh themselves in life. And these are some of my favorite books. There are others. Two of them are by Chinese writers who also, I think, are wonderful at connecting between the places. And all of these, what they have in common is they all present China as a place populated by ordinary people with interesting and complicated worldviews, which gets away from the monolithic Chinese, which gets in the way of all this. And you can choose between any of these books and a few others that I think are very good, or you can wait until next fall and buy Chinese Characters, Fast-Changing Lives in a Fast-Changing Land, which is a book I'm co-editing for University of California Press. That's a kind of anthology of the new China writing. And it has chapters by Peter Hessler and Leslie T. Chang, Evan Osnos, who's the current New Yorker correspondent on China, some of my favorite people to read on China, and also Shujin Eberlein, who's a talented Chinese-born and now US-based writer of short stories and memoirs about China, as well as some people who I think are going to be the kind of next generation of really interesting China writers. A few academics leaving their footnotes behind and specialized language. So I'm excited about that. But this is also the worst of times for about China, because the nightmares are so strong and inflected in so many ways now, both military fears, economic fears, cyberspace fears, you name it, that you have these books that have these very scary visions of China. And I hate to say it, but one of them is by a University of California Irvine faculty member in the business school, the one, The Coming China Wars over there. I still haven't met him, actually. We should probably debate at some point. But that's a book that I actually think of as the kind I'm arguing against. It presents China as this unified threat. And I also I hate the title, Coming China Wars, but I hate the title of his newer book even more, because he co-wrote a new book that just came out called Death by China. And so I'm wondering where he goes from there. We've kind of bottomed out. There's another way of thinking of the dream and the nightmare is sinomania and sinophobia. Well, the dream was always about conversion, but there's another strain in American or Western thinking about China, which has always been this special admiration for China as this great society that has things we can learn. It's often we want them to convert, but there are also these ideas that, if only we could do things the way they did. And this was true with Japan, too. The Japan fear moment of the 1980s, it was also Japan as number one, like, how can American businesses learn from this? Or there's kind of, so sinomania is this enduring thing. It goes back to the Jesuits, or in a way to Marco Polo, this strain of the Chinese really have this amazing way of doing things that maybe we should learn something from, even though we want to kind of get them to be more like us to be able to deal with them, versus sinophobia, the great fear of China. But then there are some times when there's a curious mix of the two. This book, When China Rules the World, got an enormous amount of attention in the US, reviews and so forth, a year and a half ago or so. But it also is beloved in China. It sounds like a sinophobia book, When China Rules the World. And this is an image from not from the book, but from a Wall Street Journal article about China's rising place. And you can even see sinophobia meet sinomania in some of Thomas Friedman's writings, where he's both worried about China outdoing us, but he's really admiring and sort of says, maybe if we could do things a little bit more the way they do it without losing who we are, we could really do things well. But I think this, too, gets in the way of, it leads to a simplification, even if you're simultaneously admiring and fearing. We need to get beyond that somehow. And then I've played to a lot of, pandered to an audience, whether I pandered to students or to teachers and community members or people who know lots of other things. I pander. And so I've given you Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I've given you South Park. I've done all that. And I am an academic, and I worry sometimes when I go in these routes. I've talked about pop music, John Denver even. I am an academic and a scholar, and so when I show this image, I've been showing this image for a few years about the excitement that was being whipped up for World Expo, which wasn't a big deal here, but was a big, big deal in China. And I would show this photo I took a few years ago of a giant video billboard in Shanghai. I'd show it to just say, this is how much excitement this event is generating there. But recently, it seemed kind of creepy. It's this giant baby coming at you. And this is where the scholar in me comes out, because when I look at that, I actually think about a line from Homer Simpson, who said, "Children are our future unless we stop them now." And I think the final takeaway about American ideas about China is the anxiety used to be, would China ever grow up? It was a kind of patronizing, paternalistic view of China, that we were the adult country and they were this either dangerously unruly baby or child, or one that with a little bit of guidance and a little bit of luck would become this kind of adult, just like under our tutelage. Now we're dealing with a China that is adult, that's a serious player on a world stage, and is not living up to that imagined tutelage by us. And now we have to adjust to being the two biggest kids on the block. So thanks for your attention.
So I think you have a few minutes for Q&A.
Yeah, I'd love any questions. The book's in question and answer format. I need to do a second edition, so I need good questions to answer. Thanks.
How does the old hardline leadership in China reconcile the issue of these pockets of free market activity? Those eventually will become areas of wealth concentration and challenge the central government and its traditional control. How do they control that, or are they kind of accepting the fact that there's going to be this evolution, that perhaps communism and the whole centrality of control and economic development might go away? How do they see that, and how do they reconcile that?
That's a great question, and it's in a way the version of how communist is communist China now. I mean, or what is it? One of the things is there are different strains to what the Communist Party has always been about. And I think the communist parties that have stayed in power since 1989, 1991 have something in common: Cuba, North Korea, Vietnam, and China. They're all communist parties that came to power in part through independence struggles, or things that were seen as protecting the nation's integrity against threats from the outside. And so in a certain way, all of them had as their core belief in Lenin's idea that imperialism was one of the great threats of the world, as well as Marx's ideas about economic things. And they were also in some ways nationalistic movements, patriotic movements. So the Communist Party came out of that milieu. Now it's called the Communist Party still, but that class struggle side of it has been jettisoned. What's been left is this idea, this desire for, well, Lenin had this idea imperialism was bad. He also had this idea that a backward country would have the best chance of being strong in the world if it was led by a tightly controlled political elite, a disciplined party. They've held on to that. And the nationalist side, this sort of idea that the reason we deserve to rule is we were the first organization that succeeded in making China able to stand on its own again. So I think if you want to strip away what's left of a kind of an original vision from the Communist Party, this idea of class struggle or having a distinctive economic thing is really gone. I mean, they will say it's socialism with Chinese characteristics, but it looks a lot like, for lack of a better word, state capitalism, which is one thing Ian Bremmer has been describing it as. There's still a lot of state control of parts of the economy. In parts of China, it's still state-led development. In parts, it's much more mixed economic development. But I think one of the things, this willingness to put everything on a back burner as long as the country keeps getting stronger, developing economically, I think the Communist Party in China thinks being able to deliver those things has been what's allowed it to outlive what some analysts were calling the Leninist extinction around 1991. So you got to keep doing that. And if that involves a certain amount of local experimentation, as long as locales stay under the central control in certain ways, it's a bargain they can make. And there's just been a very flexible strategy. There's different methods of control are used in different parts of the country. Xinjiang and Tibet, there's a much firmer kind of control. The internet gets out of hand, you shut the internet down. More economically developed parts, you can't shut the internet down without doing damage to your economic life. So in a place like Shanghai, that's not really an option, so you try to control and censor the internet and flood it with stuff that backs up your point of view. Hong Kong would be the great test case for this. The fact that Hong Kong, and I don't think any of us expected Hong Kong to have the degree of difference still that it has from the rest of China almost 15 years after the handover. People talk about self-censorship in Hong Kong, and these are important things. But in Hong Kong bookstores, you can still buy books that aren't for sale any place in the mainland. You can buy books about the Dalai Lama. So there is, in Hong Kong, this willingness to say, as long as they're under the official umbrella of the Chinese Communist Party and the state, we'll allow things to be done very differently there economically, but also culturally. Just shows how willing the bargain is. Like, as long as we can control overall political control, we can allow an enormous amount of regional or local variation. So far, they've been betting that this prosperity or this will be enough to keep from the kind of pressures of democratization that tend to come with rising GDP. And so far, they keep proving the predictions of their demise wrong. So I'm kind of loath to predict any particular moment when they'll fall. Eventually, the Chinese Communist Party will fall. You heard it here. But every regime falls eventually, every form of government ever. So I just wouldn't, their days are supposed to be numbered. We've been hearing that since '89. It's a big number now. So, yeah. Thanks for that question. Yeah.
We've got a microphone
Oh,
we're just going to record with. Hang on one second. I want to pick up with your two kids on the block concept that you ended on and the idea of U.S. paternalistic attitude. In recent NPR and The World pieces on what the Chinese feel about both the Eurozone meltdown and the U.S. economy woes, they've interviewed Chinese officials, experts, and there's been this very patronizing, like, you guys need to get your economic, together.
Yeah.
And I was stunned in a way. I was like, seriously? Like, it hasn't been that long since the Great Leap Forward, or like, do you have no sense of understanding of trying to muddy your way through economically? But there is a sense of like looking down on, and like, we know what we're doing and you don't. And so is this a common attitude, and what do you make of this? Like, now we're the teenagers and they're the parents.
Yeah, that's really a very good point. Well, a couple of things. One is, and by the way, I love NPR and the world's China correspondents right now. I think are doing often great things, and Marketplace has a really good person in China right now as well. Couple things. That's one strain of at least official Chinese rhetoric, and it goes, and the thinking behind it goes something like this. The current leaders of China, most of them think of themselves as quite technocratic leaders. And they would say, we actually go about problem solving very different than in the period of Mao. I mean, so the Great Leap Forward, they would say that's irrelevant, because that was a period when the Chinese Communist Party was making decisions based on ideology and personality. Now you have a bunch of engineers running the country. And if you actually, this is the tricky part about the rhetoric of even sometimes a Thomas Friedman, who says, I love democracy, but you can't help wishing sometimes that America was a little bit more like authoritarian China, but technocratic China. We don't like the authoritarian, but if we could be a bit more, get people in charge who really know how to get things done. So I think the current leadership, it's partly it can be partly Schadenfreude after so long having a feeling of backwardness to now feel like, getting through the economic crisis of 2008 so much more smoothly than Western countries did, and in some ways by doing things less half-heartedly that we were actually trying to do, like the stimulus. I mean, if the stimulus argument was the way to get out of the recession, China had the biggest stimulus package, exponentially bigger, with these giant construction projects and new subway systems. And so part of it, you could imagine them saying, look, if the US really believed that that was the way to go, why doesn't LA now have the best subway system in the world? Just throw the money at it. So it's partly that. But I think that strain of boastfulness, it's not true across the board, because there is this very strong chatter now on the web, which is a lot of interested in the world kind of Chinese who are saying a lot of China's successes are just kind of paper thin, and saying, look, the bragging about fast trains is fine, but it looks like all sorts of corners were cut that are now causing deaths. And not just that, but how can we be so boastful when we can't trust the milk powder we're drinking won't be laced with poison? And though there's a new phrase that's coming in called blood-stained GDP, of people in China who are complaining about high growth rates that are coming at too high a cost. So there is talking back and forth, but that one strain, I know what you're talking about, and it wasn't there. It hasn't been there. It actually hasn't been there in an ironic way. It hasn't been there since a certain period of the Mao period, when there was this exalted notion of what China could accomplish because it's just so big, that there's this kind of cockiness to it. So they're both there, but I wouldn't take that as, it's not everyone in China thinks that way. That is one, and I can see why it's an attractive way to do it. There was boasting when their trains were faster than Japan's, and now there's boasting that their economy is booming at a moment when ours is having so much trouble. And it's a response to, I think, the years and years of it being that we felt we were lecturing them. And it's not a pleasant side of what's going on in China now. It is a worrisome side, and it's also a worrisome side when it's projected into other parts of the world to say, if you want to look for somebody to model yourself on, you should be looking at Beijing, not at DC. Look at what a mess DC is. And of course, we make it easier for them. That strain. Do you want to pick people? Yeah.
Oh, no, go ahead. I'll follow.
Okay. Maybe there are two people here, so you can hand the mic to one, and then the other, and then there's one in the back.
Okay. China's been investing gangbusters in Africa. And I've seen kind of two different developments that could take. One is where the Chinese say to, especially sub-Saharan Africa, look, not too long ago we were where you were, and we've invested our way out of this, and we're growing, and we can share this wonderful solution we've come up with you, and it'll be good for both of us. Or it could just be flat out new imperialism, exploitive imperialism. Which way do you think this is going to go?
Both. I'm an academic after all. It's part of both. I think, and this is one thing China and the U.S. have in common. Again, if you want to, not that we're moral equivalents on this, but we always said we weren't imperialist powers like the other powers. You can trust us because we aren't like the British or the French who colonized you. We're gonna, we'll respect you, and then often it would be create a regime that likes to give us their, likes to trade with us, and then we pull our punches on criticizing human rights. We would hear a lot more about Saudi Arabian sexism if we didn't if Saudi Arabia wasn't the kind of ally it is. And so, of course, we have differential criticisms there. So some of what goes on with China goes a step further and says, these days, actually under Mao, there were efforts to reach out, saying, as fellow sufferers under colonialism, convert to our ways. Now what China's saying is, no, we're even different from the U.S., because the U.S. whether they colonized you or not, tried to convert you to their political system. We're not doing that either. You just will protect what we believe in is everybody should go their own way. So they're not saying the Chinese model is have a government like ours or an economic strategy like ours. They're saying the Chinese model is to not interfere, because interference by people who thought they knew better is what was the tragedy for so many parts of the developing world. And of course, part of it is maximizing or ensuring control of natural resources. Some of it is doing things that are beneficial to the countries involved. So it's really, you can't choose between the two, and it's different between them. And just to say, there will be an excellent book on China and Africa out soon. A guy named Howard French, who was the New York Times Africa correspondent for about 10 years, and then China correspondent for about 5 years, and learned Chinese, speaks a variety of depressingly large, from my point of view, number of languages, and has been traveling to Africa recently, spending a lot of time in Chinese immigrant communities in Africa trying to figure out this. He wrote a piece in The Atlantic, The Next Empire, I think was the name, which is available online maybe about a year ago, that I think is the best thing on China-Africa that I've read. Yeah.
I'm a threat-oriented guy a little bit, but I don't have nightmares.
Good.
Three things. Ed Friedman, the political scientist at Wisconsin, is very concerned about nationalism in China. And I'd like you to comment on that. And then another one is that I took a course one time from a guy that studied the Chinese military. And he said it's impossible to understand the Chinese leadership and government without taking into account the role of the military. And the third one is a crackdown on the Falun Gong. I was wondering if you could comment on some of those things.
You don't have any tough questions. Okay. All right, quick answers. Nationalism is worrisome, but I think Chinese nationalism is also worrisome to China's leaders, because they know that the history of the 20th century in China was nationalism directed at foreigners, often morphing into critique of the status quo at home as well. So I think the Chinese government tries to build up this kind of popular nationalism, but also then becomes nervous by it. And I think both of these are part of the equation there. And there are a lot of varieties of nationalism, but it's certainly a major important topic. The military, yes, the political structure and the military structure are intertwined in really interesting and complicated ways. I'll just say that the most interesting thing I've read lately on that is in a book called The Party, The Secret World of China's Communist Leaders, by a guy named Richard McGregor, who was the Financial Times China correspondent. And his argument is the big thing is the evolution of the Communist Party and what it has done, how it works, and how exactly its authority works, which is one of the hardest things to study or to really get details about, because it's so hard to penetrate the inside of it. We still don't have a good idea about the leadership transition that's going on, things like that. But he has a chapter on the party military thing that I think is quite good. And crackdown on Falun Gong, I mean, there are all sorts of ways to go at it, but I think the key thing in sorting out, the governments responded to different kinds of challenges in different ways. With some kinds of protests, it compromises, it gives in, it tries to buy off leaders. In others, it cracks down medium hard. In others, it cracks down really hard. What it cracks down hardest on, the two things it fears most, are rival organizational structures. And Falun Gong was organized. And anything that cuts across regional and class lines. And Falun Gong cut across regional and class lines. So even if Falun Gong, clearly didn't have a political agenda, those two aspects of it made the Chinese government very skittish and explain, I think, partly the crackdown. There was still the memory of solidarity in Poland, which had been all those things. A different kind of organization, some ties to religion, in that case the Catholic Church, and cutting across class lines. The government feels it can manage things that are just in one locale or just one group, but it worries about things that cross lines, and it also worries about anything that has a charismatic figure as the central So that would explain why also there's such a harsh crackdown in Tibet. Because again, there goes across class lines. And across regional lines, it's all in Tibet, but Tibet and the ethnic Tibetan parts of China are an enormous part of the country. So those would be the quick answer to those, big answers, yeah. There's somebody down here.
What are your thoughts about China's current role in the Middle East, and how have they been affected by the recent uprisings of the last 2 years?
Yeah, great. That's one that has to be in the second edition, because it's a... here are a couple of answers. I mean, the Chinese government got very nervous when there were calls for jasmine protests in China, which it's unclear. They were quite chimerical. I mean, it may have been just on websites outside of the US, but still, for the same reasons I just described, there's fear about this. I mean, what causes anxiety is images of something like Tahrir Square, where it's people of all social groups and generations coming together to complain about inflation and corruption, which are two things that there's a lot of complaint on about China as well. And this idea that new media might have been playing some special role in this, Twitter and Facebook and things. So China's already blocking Facebook and Twitter, but there are things just like Facebook and Twitter with some interesting Chinese twists in China. So nervousness. But one of the things about how it will affect things long term, though, is to look at how the Chinese Communist Party handled the fall of communism in Eastern and Central Europe, now, which also made them nervous, solidarity and things. But within a couple of years, they knew how to tell the story in a way that was fairly comforting to the Communist Party rather than threatening. They focused a lot on Yugoslavia going from a fairly stable, peaceful place to being one of this sort of trouble spots of the world. They focused on the Soviet Union going from being a strong power to a much weaker Russia, going on the skids economically and becoming Moscow becoming a less important player in world affairs. So by the late 1990s, they were saying to the Chinese people in various ways through the way they managed the news, don't talk much about Czech Republic or Poland, talk a lot about Yugoslavia and Russia as examples of what happens, and say in effect, well, you might not like communism, but there's something worse out there. It's called post-communism. Just look at it. So I think the legacy of Arab Spring will depend a lot on the fate of the countries of the region, say, a year or two from now. If all of those countries are economically in pretty good shape as well as being stable, an argument the Communist Party has made for why you don't do things like that is undermined. But I don't think that'll be the case. I think, unfortunately, at least one or two places will be the kind of counterpart to the Yugoslavia or the Soviet Union examples, or will it become so much in the kind of control of a foreign power that there too they'll say, you might like the moves that were going there, but think about what the downside is. And that's already being said about Libya. I mean, I was in China when it became clear that the balance had tipped against Gaddafi. And the press was filled with, this is really about places like France wanting to keep control of oil, and they'll become client states. And that's like part of the thing that Chinese grew up dreading, is this idea of becoming really in the control of another country again. So it both sets up the possibility for becoming a model, and plenty of people are inspired by it, but at the same time, there's a way in which I think that story can become something much less threatening to the status quo. So we need to stay tuned there. Thanks. Oh, I don't know how to choose that. All right, so in the back there, yeah. And in fact, you all want to ask a quick question, I'll answer them all at once. How about that?
And my question may not be long. I had the pleasure to hear you speak in 2010 at the time of the Great Exposition in China. And now that that exposition is all said and done, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the way and the vision that China presented of its role in the world. Thank you.
Great. All right, let's take this one right in front of you. I'll try to roll these. Yeah.
My question?
Yeah.
Chinese language is so beautiful, poetic, yet very practical.
And impossible to learn. No, I'm just kidding.
But I think that's the reason why they try to simplify the language. But the simplification really take away the characteristic and the identity of the language. So will the simplified Chinese and traditional Chinese coexist, or where would that go? That's my question.
One more over here. Yeah?
Older generation to actually pretend that they don't see the younger generation. I mean, I grew up in the Midwest, so I know that's active also in the U.S. But do you think that that's still, this was 10 years ago that I was in Asia, do you think that's still at play, and how does that manifest itself so that you can actually kind of erase people? Like, I don't see you, so it can't be happening.
Wow.
So do you think that that is manifesting itself currently in China?
Very, very interesting. All right, these are all very interesting questions. The expo, I think what the thing that surprised me most after the expo rather than during it was that how much the event got taken over by the nation rather than the city. So the icon of the expo didn't become something that spoke to Shanghai. It was this China pavilion that was all about this kind of vision of China. I think the expo was about reasserting that kind of national knitting together over the locals. So that was one thing. And it just didn't capture the international imagination in the West. But I think it did play a role in connecting China to other parts of the world. But mostly it was a domestic event that I think some Chinese and some in the world thought it could mean more to other countries. And it really was for Chinese in other parts of China who hadn't had the chance to go abroad to get this virtual tour of the world, which is actually what World's Fairs have often been. With the American Midwest, there would be ones that would be largely attended by Americans trying to get a sense of the wider world. So the idea was really about a stage in China's fascination with the wider world rather than projection. The Olympics had much more of an impact on catching the world's attention about what had been going on in China. With the characters, I mean, I know they are beautiful, and the simplified one strips some of the layers of meaning, but it's still a pretty fascinating language even in the simplified characters. And I don't think it's that daunting to learn, in fact, or rather, what I always used to say, because I'm not very good at languages, was at least if you're an American, study some Chinese, because if you know a little bit of Chinese, you know more Chinese than almost any other Americans. Whereas if you learn a lot of Spanish or French, you still have lots of people who know more. But what I felt going to China is there's more of a readiness to be appreciative of even somebody who knows a little Chinese or knows a little about the language. Even if you can't master the written language, you actually still, with simplified, but even more so with complex, you get a window onto the language, into the culture by how the language works, which is very, very interesting. I was starting to resist because I was going to keep from refraining, criticizing anything that was said last night. There were a couple of things I felt critical of. And the main one was, even though there was a lot that I admired about the keynote talk, he lapsed into saying in Asia they do things differently. And from my point of view, and the language would be a great example of it, in many ways China and Japan are so radically, radically different. So it's very complicated. There are some habits that flow, they influence each other, but even the language, Japanese is really hard to learn, I think, because grammatically it's very complicated. It's a merger, it's an amalgam of different languages rather than being one that has links to something very long ago. So in that sense, actually, Japanese is more like English, a hodgepodge of influences flowing together, complicated rules and grammar. Chinese, at least, is very straightforward. But what you were saying about youth, and then you saved it by saying I'm in the Midwest, from the Midwest, so I know that this age overlooking youth. No, it's really fascinating, because I think in another talk that I've been giving, or I gave a version of it, Lewis and Clark yesterday, I talk about how I think the most important intellectual figure right now in China is a guy named Han Han, who tapped into the internet, interested in the world, interested in politics, 20 to 30, 20-somethings in China all know him. And he's the most widely read blogger in the world. He's a very interesting, hard to categorize figure who's not, there was a New Yorker profile of him. I used to say I wish there was something in English that was good to read about him, but now there is. Evan Osnos wrote a piece in the New Yorker over the summer about him that captures it. But until he's very hard to classify as a bad boy blogger, race car driver, novelist. So he wrote this he was a high school dropout who wrote this novel about sort of Catcher in the Rye-esque, what a drag it is to be a teenager in this society thing that was very popular. He's moved to being more and more political in his blog posts, which sometimes get taken down off the web right away, sometimes but are instantly reposted many places. But he's not explicitly political often enough to get himself in trouble. But I wonder now, just hearing that, if part of the reason why, and those of us who think he's really important and admire a lot of what he does are torn, because the more we say he's the person who really matters, the more temptation it might be for the government to move against him. But I think they're worried in part, calculating that he is getting some people who are not very political to think in new ways about politics. He writes blog posts like, if you can protest against a foreign country and you can't say the same things about your own leaders, what's the point? You're not really free to protest. But he doesn't then make everything on his blog about, so we should do X, Y, and Z. But the more we say he's the one that we should really be paying attention to, it could have the effect of having the government say, well, he's the one I guess we should be paying attention to. But after your comment, I wonder if he's partly under the radar or not taken as seriously, both by some Western journalists or policymakers and by some Chinese ones, because of not just his youth, but youth plus lack of location within an elite institution. Because I think in China, what the students at Beijing University are thinking these days is much more important to the government than what the students at Harvard are thinking about is to our government. Because there's a tradition of the kind of young scholar, the next generation of leaders or the young technocrats that could be it. So they are taken seriously and not overlooked, and the party is going to great lengths to cultivate that part of talent. But maybe these other youth things are seen as, can't take them so seriously until you get to a point of larger visibility and age. You could say somebody like Ai Weiwei, who's sort of a punk artist, but at a more mature status and things, does get to their attention. So, really interesting question. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you for all the questions. Thanks.